CNET 160, the CISM class, and today the paper's due, so hopefully you people are turning those in on Canvas. And we're going to just talk about Chapter 3C here. So I've got the slides coming up. All right, so let me get to the start of it here. Okay, and let me see if that looks all right. I think it does look all right. Okay, good. So we're down to Part 3 in the risk management life cycle. So you have to identify your assets, and you have to decide how valuable they are, so you can decide how much it's worth securing them. You have hardware assets like servers and workstations. You may have other things like storage and replacement components, and they're very often poorly inventoried and maintained. I know there are a lot of stories about companies that just are closing down, so they just let people steal things from the office as their severance pay and such. Often people don't really know where all the laptops are and stuff. There is no presentation today. Yeah, if students want to give a presentation, talk to me about it after the lecture. All right, I should be able to fit a few of those in if people want to do late presentations. All right, and so a lot of people use software to keep track of their assets, especially your software assets. You do this, you can see how many copies of software you have and whether you paid the licenses and stuff, but a lot of people also just scan their machines and such. This is important not only to keep track of how many machines you have and where they are, but also to make sure they have their antivirus and their patches and such. And by the way, these lists are often poorly maintained. I've heard of companies that don't even bother to have a wiring diagram of the physical wiring of their offices because they found it was never up to date. They just make everybody do a physical audit every time they want to change anything. That's one way to go when you just give up all hope of controlling it. So you have to write down the information about your assets, the location, who owns it, who's responsible for it, that sort of thing would be good. But if you have to do a physical inventory periodically to find out if it's true, because people physically move things and take things, and people steal things, and you would never really know that your computer record is not correct unless you do a manual audit of checking the tags and seeing where the real devices are. And then you have information assets, your customer information, your intellectual property, your business detail, and of course your virtual assets, your cloud servers and so on. And all these things have various consequences if you lose them, and costs to replace them, in addition to other costs, like if you're losing customer information, that's a breach and you're going to have regulatory fines and all sorts of things. Then you have assets held by another company, which is the problem with the cloud. You rent things like Amazon servers and you put company data on there. Now you don't even have full control over the physical location of those things. And often companies suffer from VM sprawl, where divisions of the company are renting cloud services and putting company data on it, and the security team doesn't even know that's happening. Sometimes the IT team doesn't even know that's happening. I remember this is why one of the first questions you ask a company when they want to be secure is, what is your all-important files? Okay, how many copies are there of that all-important data, and where are they? And most companies cannot answer that question. It's on the server, it's on a backup, it's on individual laptops, it's on thumb drives. People put it in their Google Drive, people put it in their Dropbox, some people have it on their home system. You know, how many copies are there of that data? And then we can ask, how have you protected it? So the first thing is just to keep track of it at all. Microsoft several years ago added to OneDrive a feature that would encrypt stuff with a key tied to your Active Directory login, so that if you made a copy of company data and then they fired you, you would no longer be able to decrypt it. So at least the unauthorized copies you made in other accounts would stop being openable. That's a start. But controlling copies of your data is really important. And so that's the point, that's VM sprawl. By the way, sometimes the machines are generated via elasticity. I'm going to be a Kubernetes administrator soon, and Kubernetes will spin up extra copies of virtual machines in response to load. So when you ask how many servers are there with that data on it, the answer might vary with time. So that's another thing to know. And if you use Azure, Microsoft Azure by default doesn't even tell you what country your data is in or what country the machine is in. You have to pay extra for that. Because they just guarantee it will be available, but they just move it to wherever they have to move it. And that might be a real problem, especially if you have the kind of data that's not allowed to just casually move across boundaries. All right. Anyway, And software-defined networking is part of this, where it automatically creates new devices, automatically assigns them new virtual IP addresses and connects to them. That's what Kubernetes does. All right, so then you got to classify your assets. Not all assets are the same. You determine what their usage and what the risk is and how critical they are. Criticality, it means that if you lose them, it will have a very serious effect on your business. It might be because it's sensitive information, like customer information, or it might be operational dependency, where you need to have that data in order to run your company. So then that's the basis for protecting it, making extra copies of it for redundancy, and planning for business continuity in case of a disaster. You'll want to have extra copies of the critical information, and of course access management, limiting who can get at it. So the best approach is to first identify and classify the assets, then class the information assets, then the systems. Here's a fun fact. The data is worth more than the hardware. This is always the case. You wouldn't bother with the hardware unless the data was worth more than the hardware. So, all right, but people often overlook things. Unstructured data, data outside the approved systems, and so on. It's too easy to overlook data. And so then, to classify your information, you analyze it for value, criticality, integrity, and sensitivity. So you consider the monetary value, how critical it is to the operation of your company, how important it is that it has to be accurate, how much would it hurt you if there were mistakes in there, and sensitivity, like personally identifiable information of your customers and employees, which would cause various problems if you leaked that. It would be a breach. All right, and so here's some classification levels you might like secret things are things like encryption keys and plans, passwords. Then restricted is credit card numbers, bank account numbers, where of course some of your employees are allowed to get at them, but they're not supposed to expose them to the world. And then confidential stuff that's not that sensitive, like your network diagrams and such. And then public, things intended to be published, like advertising material and so on, press releases. This is a reasonable level of classification for a private company. The military, of course, has a different one. And so then you'd have rules of how you're going to handle it. So secret, restricted, confidential, and public, you'd have the types of information, then you'd have how it's going to be stored on a server, on mobile devices, in the cloud, and in email. And I must say, I'm doing exactly this in one of my consulting jobs at a financial institution. They have about 100 security policies, and part of my class is the students are given a scenario like you are developing a new phone app which is going to do banking, and you're going to have data on it, and you're going to have data on the server, and what are the policies that say, how encrypted does it have to be? How long before the password expires? How do you transmit it? And they have policies for all that, like this. They have a whole list of policies, how data must be transmitted, if it's going to a partner company, if it's going to a branch of the same company, how often the screen has to black out if you walk away from it, all sorts of things. This is what you have to do. You have to have policies for all that. And so you'll have how your website's going to handle all these different things. Are you going to fax it? Are you going to ship hard copies or store hard copies? When are you going to destroy them? You have to have all these things defined, and you have to enforce these policies. Otherwise, you're going to lose the stuff, and then when you end up having to justify what you did in court and stuff, they're going to say, did you actually plan for this and do something intelligent, or are people just throwing the paper around in an unlocked dumpster and stuff, which happened to a lot of companies. They were just dumping, I think it happened at Kaiser, a major hospital around here, they were just dumping patient records in a dumpster without shredding them that wasn't locked. And people just found them in there, and that's, that's a breach. So you determine systems by what they do. There's different kinds of servers. There's firewalls, there's databases, there's time servers, and you might have different physical locations, and they're also classified by what type of activity goes on there. And then, of course, you have network segmentation. You have the internet, totally untrusted, coming in through a firewall to stop the most obvious attacks. Then you have a demilitarized zone, which is a semi-trusted network where you place things that are supposed to be widely available to the internet, like your email server and your web server, but you don't put anything very confidential on those machines because they're likely to get hacked. You have another more restrictive firewall to make a more restrictive internal network, and typically people have to prove that they're an employee here before they can get in here, and in here you have your internal corporate data, your development software, and so on. This is a typical way you do it, and realistically, it's much more segmented than that. I know City College is segmented into 100 VLANs as of a few years ago when I saw the network diagram. So It's much more complicated than this even, but this is the general philosophy. And so then you have to evaluate your assets. You can just rate them from 1 to 10 in a qualitative manner, which ones are more important than others, or you can try to actually come up with a dollar amount, but that's usually going to turn out to be a guess anyway. Replacement cost, the book value. Net present value is measuring how much revenue is being generated by an asset. Redeployment cost is how much to recreate the virtual machines. Then there's how much would it cost to reacquire it. And then there's consequent financial cost, which is the cost of a breach, which often is completely unrelated to the direct monetary value of the data, like your customers' credit card numbers. When you lose those, then you have regulatory fines and reputation damage, and your stock falls and all that. And that's all the consequent financial cost of a breach, which is not directly related at all to the direct value of the objects you lose. All right, anyway, let's take a look at a Kahoot. I should have them ready to go. This is 3C1 right here. Okay. Let's see, I got 15 people online, a couple in the room, so there may be a few more coming, I don't know. I'll wait till the end of the song. All right. All right. So, which one of these will be automatically created through elasticity? That's it. You guys have got it. Elastic cloud computing automatically spins up more virtual servers as required. That's what Amazon's, I think it's called Elastic Cloud Computing, something like that. All right. So which process discovers hardware theft? You have to physically wander around and check the physical location of devices. That's physical inventory. All right. All right. What's the cost of a breach? That's the consequent financial cost, and by the way, it's incredibly hard to measure. I've seen estimates that vary from $2 per record to $200 per record. It's not clear how much your stock will fall and all that. I mean, the regulatory fines you might be able to guess, but the actual long-term cost to your company is probably very little more than a guess. All right, and what item measures the revenue generation of an asset? That's the net present value. All right. All right. Let's take a look at some more of this. Got time? All right. So identifying threats. This is often how you can analyze your security posture by starting with assets and how you're going to protect them, or you can do it by starting with who's going to attack you and how you will stop them, and both of those are good ways to go about it. So you have internal threats, which are people inside the company doing bad things, external threats, and then the external has two special categories. The advanced persistent threats are the really powerful, scary attackers, and the emerging threats are people who use the latest attack, which is not the same thing as the advanced threats. An advanced persistent threat actor is smart, and they will not use the most powerful attack. They will use the appropriate attack, and that typically is, first they do a weak attack to see if you have any defenses. And if you don't have any defenses, they use weak attacks because they're not going to burn their powerful tools against an adversary that doesn't need it. All right, so you can get threats of intelligence. There are examples in the ISO 27000 stuff, in the NIST stuff, general threat events, and you can also subscribe to up-to-date threat intelligence sources from the antivirus companies and such. And so here's internal threats. The most common thing that happens to cause problems at your company is not even an attack, it's your personnel making mistakes. Accidentally deleting files, accidentally putting something on the wrong folder that exposes it and all that jazz, making mistakes in haste, for making design decisions. And then, of course, there's the attacks, where they're somehow tricked into doing something bad, or they're disgruntled or bribed or something, and they deliberately do bad things. And all those things happen too, but the vast majority of problems are caused by well-meaning personnel making mistakes of some sort in their job, of course. Then you have rogue employees. There are a lot of examples of that. There's a famous case, a network manager in San Francisco was locked everybody out of the network because he was disgruntled, because he had 4 felony convictions for armed robbery, and he had concealed that, and they were about to enforce background checks that would cause him to get fired, so he froze the city network, hoping to avoid that. There's a famous securities trader in the UK who overcame the bank security controls to invest a vast amount of money. He was only authorized to invest like up to $50,000, but he invested like $1 billion in something risky and lost it all. And then there was of course, Snowden. I don't know why they bother to pretend these people aren't incredibly obvious who they are. Snowden, a trusted administrator in an intelligence agency who leaked classified documents. This happened a couple of times. Chelsea Manning did it, and Snowden did it. This is the problem. You trust your people, and then what about when your people betray you? It's a problem. And then, of course, there's just stupidity, like Giuliani. Giuliani just had his telephone dial a reporter in his pocket, and then he was talking about his somewhat confidential financial things and stuff. There's lots of things. These are man-made threats where people just make mistakes. Put a USB around and all that jazz. Go talk about confidential things in public so people can overhear them and things like that. And then there's natural threats, of course, earthquake, fire, flares, plagues, pandemics and stuff. And external threats. Your former employees, this is extremely common, that you fire somebody, they are disgruntled, and you don't cancel their access to the systems right away, so they go away and access the systems and trash them. That happens all the time. Consultants, contractors are often how people get in because they have some access to your network and they're often not very secure. Then you have competitors and hacktivists. Many denial of service attacks, I've heard some people say it's the majority of them, are in fact for hire, and people hire hackers to attack their competitors. So their website will go down, so they'll come by at my shop instead. And of course you have government agencies, criminal organizations, terrorist groups, and so on, all out there as people who are attacking people with cyber attacks, and you have to consider how likely it is that they will attack you and what you'd do about it if they did. So they might be just trying to get a competitive advantage over you, but they might be trying to get money out of you or make some kind of political statement, or it could just be revenge or ego. All these are the kind of things that motivate different types of attackers. And so the APTs are nation state. This is enemy military, typically China and Russia and North Korea and Iran. if you are a critical asset or you're working for the government or for the military, they might decide to target you, and they will sneak into your network and establish a persistent foothold so they can continue to steal data for years. You may never notice them, but it's very hard to keep them out. And of course, this would depend on your business whether you're going to be a target of this. If you have important cutting edge technology or you're working for the military or the government, then you're more likely to track them. If you're a less important business, you might not attract these sort of attacks. And then emerging threats. Use the new techniques like the 0 days, the latest attacks. And of course, those are things that scare people. In fact, most people worry about this far too much. There's a lot of studies that show that people are often reading the news and going to DEF CON and hearing the talks and freaking out about the very latest exploits, but almost all the attacks use things that have been patched like 5 years earlier, just mistakes, because they don't have to use the latest stuff. They just use the same old stuff because people don't really put on their patches and inventory their machines and stuff. I've heard many security professionals say, if you want to really secure your network, you should do the Security 101 stuff. Just make sure that they're locking the doors, that you're doing background checks on your employees, that you're changing the default passwords, that you're putting on the patches that exist. They said if you just did that, that would by far be the most valuable way to secure your network, more than doing exotic, difficult things. Because that's a lot harder than you think it is, to actually make sure that those simple things actually happen. So to find your vulnerabilities, you've got to find faults in your configuration of your routers and your servers and such, where you have things in default folders, default passwords, design faults, known weaknesses. Undisclosed, unpatched weaknesses is much harder, of course. If there has not been a security advisory or a patch, it's harder to find these weaknesses and fix them. And the undiscovered weaknesses, like I say, these are the 0 days, things that nobody knows about. It's very hard to protect yourself from those. There are ways to protect yourself from 0 days, by the way. The number one way is defense in depth. You don't have just one control, you have another control and another control, so even if they get through one layer, they might not get through the next layer. And there are some people that try to detect suspicious activities. Anyway, this is what your incident response team does. If somebody gets in with a 0 day, you eventually notice unauthorized processes, unauthorized network traffic. Even if they're not using a known piece of malware, you can detect it if you have a mature incident response team that's monitoring the network, just looking for suspicious activity. It's much more difficult. And of course, third-party vulnerabilities is an issue. They might get into your cloud machines through vulnerabilities at the cloud services. So you can define threats, threat actors, vulnerabilities, asset value, and impacts. These are all things. I think we're going to go through them. All right. Anyway, so threats are bad things that might happen. Threat actors are the people that would do them. Vulnerabilities are weaknesses that allow that threat to do harm. Asset value, of course, determines how much you could lose if the attack gets in, and the impact is a measure of how much this will ultimately affect your business. So there are a lot of people who use different calculations for this. Risk is threat times vulnerability, or threat times vulnerability times asset value, or threat times vulnerability times probabilities. And all these equations are only worth remembering the general idea of, because usually all these are not really numerical values. Usually you can't really get dollar amounts here anyway. So really all you do is sort them into high, medium, and low. So hygiene is the likelihood of this. Do you actually obey your security policies? Do your people leave the door open? Do your people really put on the patches? Do you scan to make sure the patches are on there? That's the sort of thing that's hygiene. I see another comment here. What do you think are the worst threats today to economy, national security, and critical infrastructure? Well, what do I know? I mean, I think I only have sort of uneducated political speculation. I do know that there's a lot of attacks coming from China. There have been all along. In general, what they say is that the Chinese attacks are stealing intellectual property. That's their main activity, so they can make Chinese knockoffs of things. The Russian attacks are for financial gain from basically criminal organizations deploying things like ransomware and such. And North Korea primarily attacks cryptocurrency exchanges to steal money to fund their entire military. But there's of course exceptions all over the place. So anyway, that's why I think when you say what are the worst threats, you really have to customize it. You have to consider your business, what would happen to us. It will depend on your business and how big you are and how important you are and things like that. Anyway, you consider how visible your business is. You consider how likely you are to see an attack coming, what motivation is going to make someone attack you, and how skilled are they going to be. You know, if you're just a small mom and pop grocery store, nobody's probably even heard of you out of your town and you don't have to worry about that. But if you're a big company that does something like politically questionable, like selling guns that are used in an attack, you might attack political attackers. If you have U.S. military stuff, then foreign armies might be attacking you, foreign military. So, you know, you have to do threat modeling. So the impact could be direct loss of cash if they manage to steal money from your accounts, reputation damage, loss of business, reduction in market share, higher internal costs as you have to implement more cumbersome processes to run more securely, your legal problems, from liability if you get sued to compliance fines and a period of interrupting business and so on. These are all various forms of impact on your business. And so those equations sound nice, but in fact you can almost never calculate these things numerically. All you can really do is typically qualitative risk analysis. So you have probability, likely, unlikely, very unlikely, and consequences, slightly harmful, harmful, and extremely harmful, and then you decide what to do. So if something is unlikely and not very harmful, then it's an insignificant risk and you just accept that. Things that are likely and extremely harmful, these are the things you really worry about. These are the things where you really better do something, like get better firewalls or better locks on the door or something, because this is bad. Something's likely to happen that would be very harmful. All right, so this is the risk analysis techniques. So your asset has value. There are possible scenarios by which people could attack you, and then you can estimate how likely it is that that attack would happen, how vulnerable you are, and what controls do you have, and how effective are they to stop that, and then you can have some estimate of the impact of this. These are considerations when deciding which assets are worth, which threats are worth implementing countermeasures against. So to get information about this, you can interview people at the company, the owners of processes, the application developers, the security personnel, external experts. You can look at your records of previous security incidents to give you information about these attacks and how likely they are, analysis of comparable incidents that occur in other organizations, and prior risk assessments, although if the previous risk assessment was wrong, you might propagate the error into the new one, so that's a thing to be aware of. All right, and so typically you have a qualitative like high to low or a scale from 1 to 5. Sometimes you might actually have actual costs, but typically the things you can put actual costs on are the things that are not super important. Like if you have company vehicles, then if they're wrecked, you know how much it would cost you to buy another vehicle, that sort of thing, but that's usually not at the heart of your business. And so quantitative risk analysis, if you have it, you have an asset value, an exposure factor, which is how much of it will be harmed in the attack, and that gives you the single loss expectancy, how much money you will lose from a single loss. Then you have the annualized rate of occurrence, which is how many of those losses are going to happen per year, and then you can combine all those and get the annualized loss expectancy, how many dollars per year am I going to lose from this problem. And so that's how that works. So there are frameworks to use. Octave is one of them that has 8 pieces developed at Carnegie Mellon. So you establish risk measurement criteria, then an information asset profile. You identify the asset containers and areas of concern, and then you have threat scenarios, identify risks, analyze risks, and select mitigations. So like I said, there are many different frameworks, and they all do essentially the same thing, the risk analysis process. There's a Delphi method where you send questionnaires to experts to get expert opinions. You see a lot of I see a lot of news articles about this where they do surveys of like CIOs saying how many of you expect to get hacked this year or got hacked last year or feel like you need to invest more in your security team, that sort of thing. You can do an event tree analysis derived from the fault tree analysis. You diagram the consequences for an event scenario, and then you can derive this as an event tree where a series of events happen. People do tabletop exercises where they have people sit around a table representing all the different teams and say, we're going to have a scenario like bad guys put malware on the server and they start deploying ransomware. What are you going to do? And they talk about, you're going to call this person, you're going to call that person, and make sure you practiced what's going to happen. And then there's Monte Carlo analysis, where you estimate minimum, likely, and maximum values, and then try to use that to decide what range of consequences might come from the various threats. So you can evaluate your risk looking by business unit or service line, or by asset type, or by activity type, or type of consequence. These are just different ways to organize your thinking. Typically, you have risk ownership. You assign the risks to people that are management, and now it is their job to watch over this type of risk. Like somebody's in charge of phishing, somebody's in charge of malware, somebody's in charge of network DDoS attacks, and it's their job to investigate, find out what the risk is, figure out what risk treatments are required, and they're accountable for that. So here's the treatments that are available. You can accept a risk, which means you just do nothing and let it happen. You can mitigate it. You put up some kind of control to lower that risk, like a firewall or antivirus or something. You can avoid it by changing your business so you no longer do that risky activity, or you can transfer the risk to somebody else by outsourcing or getting insurance. So for risk acceptance, you do this when the cost of the mitigation is greater than the value of the asset being protected. So just letting it happen is cheaper than trying to prevent it. And at your company, you will have rules for who's allowed to make this decision. So for low risk, a CIO or manager of information security would be allowed to just accept it. But for higher risks, it'd have to be someone higher, like the president of the company or the board of directors, to accept a really high, severe risk. That's a really important decision that shouldn't be left to lower level management. So once you have accepted a risk, you should revisit it and examine it occasionally, see if the value of the asset has changed, the business activity has changed in its value, the threats have changed, or the mitigation costs have changed. Any of these might cause you to change your mind about accepting a risk. And controls is typically what you do. If you decide you want to treat the risk, then you put in some kind of control to limit that risk. It can be a technical control like a firewall or a locked door, or it can be a procedural control where you have to get approval for something before doing it. And then, of course, you got compliance rules. You have required measures from your PCI DSS compliance or HIPAA or other ones. And these things will require certain mandatory protection measures and optional measures, and usually risk assessments, where you must have people come and audit your systems to make sure you're obeying the rules. And so there's also compliance risk. Even if you don't get hacked, so there's no actual loss, failing to comply with the law will have consequences. You might have to pay fines or have sanctions. Sometimes business will choose to not comply and to just pay the fine because they figure the fine isn't that big and it would be too expensive to implement the control. This is when companies get a really bad attitude and say the government is just harassing us over nonsense. All right. So your costs and benefits, all these things will change. If you implement a control, then you'll lower the chance of a threat or the impact. You'll change the operational efficiency, for better or worse, and this gets you to the total cost of ownership. How much does it really cost you to do something? This is something Microsoft often talks about. If you use Microsoft Windows and Microsoft servers, then you have to pay licensing fees. But what Microsoft has often said is you will actually have a lower cost of ownership with Microsoft products than you would using Linux. Because even though the software is free, your employees, it's harder to find employees that are trained to operate it. You'll have to write more custom code because the code doesn't exist, and you'll end up spending more money training people and writing code and stuff. So that's an issue. The total cost of ownership of whatever you're doing can be complicated, and it's not as simple as just the purchase price of the hardware. And so here's things. You acquire the hardware, you have to deploy it and implement it, you have to maintain it, you have to test it, you have to have compliance monitoring, you have to consider your controlled processes. Your devices and procedures may limit how quickly you can get work done. You have to train your employees to do this, and you have to have end-of-life decommissioning of these devices. So that's the total cost of ownership. How much does it cost from the beginning to the end of whatever you're considering, like buying a new server, achieving ISO 27000 certification, anything like that. You figure out how much is it really going to cost you, and then you figure out how much is it really going to benefit you, and you decide whether it's worth doing or not. So let's try another bunch of cahoots, which is 3C2. All right. Good. People still coming in. I'll wait till the end of the song. All right, so which threat uses the latest techniques? Yeah, the emerging threats, not the APT, which is what I thought at first. The APT are the smartest. That doesn't mean they always use the latest techniques. Oh, all right. So insurance costs $10,000 a year. What number should you compare that to when deciding whether to get the insurance? You compare it to the annualized loss expected. That's how much dollars you're going to lose per year. This is the value of the asset. This is the exposure factor, which is what part of the asset will be lost if the bad thing happens. And this is the single loss expected. But then you need the annualized loss expected because you're paying per year. So this is how much you expect to lose per year, and this is how much it costs for the insurance. And those are the two things you compare to decide whether it's worth getting the insurance or not. All right, what method uses questionnaires given to experts? That's Delphi, just like the ancient Greek place where you would go and ask the oracle that would tell you information that supposedly came from gods and was therefore reliable. It's the same principle. All right, which item includes all the expenses resulting from a purchase? That's total cost of ownership. When you buy something, it's more than the purchase price, it's all these other costs that you're going to end up having to pay. Now you're using that thing in your business. This is what you consider total cost of ownership when deciding whether it's really worth buying some gadget. All right, that's Rollin. Lenny. Stop the video.